Chapter 3. Instruction which the Queen of Heaven gave me concerning the vows of my profession. My dear daughter, I will not deny thee the instruction thou askest of me with the desire of putting it into practice, but do thou receive it with an appreciative and devout mind, ready to follow it indeed. The wise man says, quote, My son, if thou be surety for thy friend, thou hast engaged fast thy hand to a stranger. Thou art ensnared with the words of thy mouth and caught with thy own words. Unquote. Proverbs 6:1. Accordingly, he who has made vows to God has bound his own will, so that he has no freedom of acting except according to the will and direction of him to whom he has bound himself. For he is chained down by the words of his own mouth, uttered in the profession of his vows. Before taking his vows, the choice of his ways was in his own hands, but having once bound and obliged himself, let him know that he has entirely lost his liberty, and has delivered himself up to God and his superiors. The whole ruin or salvation of souls depends upon the use of their free will, but since most men use it ill and damn themselves, the Most High has established religious life under the sacred vows. Thus the creature, by once using its liberty to make a perfect and prudent choice, can deliver up to His Majesty that very liberty which so many pervert, if it remains free and unhampered in its choice. By these vows, the liberty to do evil is happily lost, and the liberty for doing good is assured. It is like a bridle which leads away from danger and directs into the smooth and sure road. The soul is freed from the slavery and subjection of the passions, and acquires a new power over them, resuming her place as mistress and queen in the government of her kingdom, and remaining subject only to the law of grace and the inspirations of the Holy Ghost. If she thus applies her whole will solely to the fulfillment of all that she has promised to God, the Holy Spirit will govern and direct all her operations. The creature thereby passes from the condition and state of a slave to that of a child of the Most High, from an earthly to an angelic life, while the corruption and evil effects of sin cannot exert their full power. It is impossible that thou ever be able in this earthly life to calculate or comprehend what and how many are the blessings and treasures those souls gather for themselves, who with all their powers and affection strive to fulfill perfectly the vows of their profession. For I assure thee, my dearest, that those who are perfect and punctual in their religious obligations can equal and even surpass the martyrs in merit. Wow. My daughter, thou didst happily begin to gather these blessings on the day when thou didst choose the better part. But remember well that thou hast bound thyself to the eternal and mighty God, to whom the inmost secrets of thy heart are manifest. If it is so base and detestable to deceive and disappoint men in just promises, how vile is it to be unfaithful to God in the most just and holy promises. As thy Creator, Preserver, and Benefactor, He claims thy gratitude; as Father, thy reverence; as Spouse, thy fidelity; as a friend, amicable intercourse; as the most faithful, he should incite thy faith and hope; as the highest and eternal good, he should possess thy love; as the Almighty, thy entire subjection; as the most just judge, he should rouse thy humble and holy fear. Against all these allegiances and many others thou committest perfidious treason, in failing or hesitating to fulfill what thou hast promised according to thy profession. And if in all the nuns who have obliged themselves to a spiritual life and conversation, it is such a monstrous and terrible abomination to call themselves spouses of Christ while living as members and slaves of the devil, how much more abominable will it be in thee, who hast received more than they all, and therefore shouldest exceed them in loving and exerting thyself to make a return for such incomparable blessings and benefits. Consider, O soul, how detestable this fault would make thee in the sight of the Lord, of myself, and of the angels and saints, for we are all witnesses of the love and fidelity which He has shown toward thee as a generous, loving, and faithful spouse. Strive, then, with all thy heart to avoid offending Him, either in great or in small things. Do not force Him to relinquish thee, and to deliver thee over to the beastly disorders of sin, for thou knowest that this would be a greater misfortune and punishment than if He consign thee to the fury of the elements, or to the wrath of all the wild animals, or even to the rage of the demons. If all these were to execute their anger upon thee, and if the world were to heap upon thee all its punishments and insults, all would do thee less damage than one venial sin against the God whom thou art obliged to serve and love in all things and through all things. Any punishment of this life is less dreadful than sin, for it ends with mortal life, but the guilt of sin and with it punishment may be eternal. In this life, any punishment or tribulation fills mortals with fear and dread, merely because it affects the senses and brings them in close touch with it through them. But the guilt of sin does not affect them, nor fill them with dread. Men are entirely taken up by that which is visible, and they therefore do not look upon the ultimate consequences of sin, which is the eternal punishment of hell. Though this is imbibed and inseparably connected with sin, the human heart becomes so heavy and remiss that it remains as if it were stupefied in its wickedness, because it does not feel it present in its senses, though it could see and feel it by faith. This itself remains listless and dead, as if it were wanting entirely. O most unhappy blindness of mortals! O torpid negligence that holds so many souls capable of reason and of glory oppressed in deceit! There are not words or sentences sufficient to describe this terrible and tremendous danger. My daughter, haste away, and fly with holy fear such an unhappy state, and deliver thyself up to all the troubles and torments of life, which pass soon, rather than incur such a danger, for nothing will be wanting to thee if thou do not lose God. To be convinced that there is no small faults for thee and for thy state is a powerful means of saving thyself. Fear greatly the small things, for in despising small faults the Most High knows that the human heart invites other greater ones. That is not a blameless love, which does not avoid all displeasure of the beloved one. The order which religious souls should maintain in their desires should be that they strive to be punctual in fulfilling the obligations of their vows and all the virtues which are connected with them. Afterwards, secondarily, they must engage in voluntary practices, such are called supererogatory. This order, some of the souls who are misled by the devil to entertain an indiscreet zeal for perfection are wont to invert. Thus, while they fail seriously in the obligations of their state, they are eager to add other voluntary exercises and practices which are usually of small use or benefit, or arise from a spirit of presumption and singularity. They secretly desire to be looked upon as distinguished in zeal and perfection, while in truth they are very far even from the beginning of perfection. I do not wish to see in thee a fault so reprehensible. But first fulfill all the duties of thy vows and of community life, and then thou mayest add what thou canst, according to thy ability and in the inspiration of divine grace. This together will beautify thy soul and will make it perfect and agreeable in the eyes of God. The vow of obedience is the principal one in religion, for it implies a total renunciation and denial of one's will. By it the religious renounces all jurisdiction or right to say for himself, I will or I will not, I shall or I shall not. All this he throws aside and renounces by obedience, delivering himself into the hands of his superior. In order to fulfill this obligation, it is necessary for thee not to be wise in thy own conceit, nor to imagine thyself still mistress of thy likings, thy desires, or thy opinion. For true obedience must be of the quality of faith, so that the commands of the superior are esteemed, reverenced, and put into execution without any pretense of examination or criticism. Accordingly, in order to obey, thou must consider thyself without opinion, without life of thy own, without right of speech, but thou must allow thyself to be moved and governed like a corpse, alive only in order to execute devotedly all that the superior desires. Never discuss within thyself whether thou shouldest fulfill his commands or not, but only consider how thou canst best execute that which is commanded. Sacrifice thy own inclination and repress all thy appetites and passions, and when by this efficacious determination thou art dead to all the movements of self, let obedience be the soul and the life of thy works. To the will of thy superior thou must conform all thy own, with all its activity and all thy words and works. Let it be thy prayer to be able to quit thy own being and receive another new one, so that nothing be thine, and all in thee be of obedience without contradiction or resistance. Remember that the most perfect manner of obeying is to avoid offending the superior by showing that you disagree with him. he should find a willing obedience, convincing him that his commands are obeyed promptly, without objection or murmur, either in words or by any other signs. The superiors take the place of God, and he who obeys his superiors obeys the Lord himself, who is in them and governs them and enlightens them, so that their commands will be for the salvation of souls. The contempt shown to superiors passes on to God himself, who through them manifests and makes known his will. Luke 10:16. Thou must persuade thyself that the Lord moves them to speak, and that it is the word of the Omnipotent himself. My daughter, strive to be obedient in order that thou mayest speak of victories. Proverbs 21:28. Do not fear to obey, for that is the secure path, so secure that God will not bring to account the errors of the obedient on the day of judgment, but he will rather blot out other sins in consideration of the sacrifice made in obedience. My most holy Son offered his precious sufferings and death in special love for the obedient, and procured for them special rights in regard to mercy and grace, and special privileges toward the success and perfection of all that is due under obedience. Even now, in order to appease him, he reminds the Eternal Father of his obedience unto death and unto the cross. And so the Father, Philippians 2:8, and so the Father is placated toward men, because he was pleased with the obedience of Abraham and his son Isaac. He held himself obliged not only to save Isaac from death, who showed himself so obedient, but to make him the ancestor of the incarnate Word, and to designate him as the head and beginning of the great blessings. The vow of poverty is a generous renunciation and detachment from the heavy burden of temporal things. It is an alleviation of the spirit. It is a relief afforded to human infirmity, the liberty of a noble heart to strive after eternal and spiritual blessings. It is a satiety and abundance in which the thirst after earthly treasures is allayed, and a sovereignty and ownership in which a most noble enjoyment of all riches is established. All this, my daughter, and many other blessings are contained in voluntary poverty, and all this the sons of the world are ignorant and deprived of, precisely because they are lovers of earthly riches and enemies of this holy and opulent poverty. They do not consider, although they feel and suffer, the heavy weight of riches, which pins them to the earth and drives them into its very bowels to seek gold and silver and great anxiety, sleeplessness, labors and sweat, as if they were not men but wild beasts that knew not what they are suffering and doing. And if they are thus weighted down before acquiring riches, how much more when they have come into their possession? Let the countless hosts that have fallen into hell with their burden proclaim it. Let their incalculable anxieties of preserving their riches, and much more, let the intolerable laws which riches and those that possess them have foisted upon the world testify what is required to retain them. If on the one hand possessions throttle the spirit and tyrannically oppress it in its weakness, if they suppress the soul's most noble privilege of following eternal goods, and God himself, it is certain, on the other hand, that voluntary poverty restores to man the nobility of his condition, and liberating him from vile servitude, and reinstating him his noble freedom and mastery of all things. The soul is never more a mistress than when she despises them, and only then has she the more firm possession and makes the more excellent use of riches, when she gives them away or leaves them of her own free will. Only then her appetite for them is best satiated, when she does not care to possess them. Then above all is the heart set free and made capable of the treasures of divinity, for which it is furnished by the Creator with almost infinite capacity. My daughter, I wish thee to study diligently this divine philosophy and science, which the world forgets, and not only the world, but also many religious souls who have promised it to God. Great is the divine wrath on account of this fault, and suddenly will the infringers of this vow receive heavy and unexpected punishment. By setting aside their voluntary poverty, they have alienated from themselves the Spirit of Christ, my most holy Son, and all that we have come to teach men in abnegation and poverty. Although they do not feel it, because the judge delays, and they enjoy the abundance which they desire, yet in the judgment they will find themselves overwhelmed and dismayed by the rigor of their punishment, greater than they ever expected, considered, or imagined in their forgetfulness of divine justice. The temporal goods are created by the Most High for the sole purpose of sustaining life. Having attained this end, the need of them ceases. And as this need is limited, soon and easily satisfied, there is no reason that the care of the immortal soul should be only fitful and temporary, while the hunger after riches should be so perpetual and unintermitting as it has come to be among men. It is the height of perverseness for man to mix up the end and the means in an affair so important and urgent that he devote all his time, all his care, all the exertion of his powers, and all the alertness of his mind to the life of his body, of which he knows not the duration nor the end, and that on the other hand, in many years of his existence, he spare for his poor soul only 1 hour, and that very often the last and the worst one of his whole life. Make use, therefore, my dearest daughter, of the true enlightenment by which the Most High has undeceived thee. Excuse me. In regard to such a dangerous error, renounce all affection or inclination for earthly things, even under the pretext of the necessity and poverty of thy convent. Do not be over-solicitous to procure the things used for the sustenance of life. In exerting ordinary care, let it be such as will not disturb thee, when thou failest to obtain what thou desirest, and let it be without inordinate affection, even when thou seekest it for the service of God. For thou must know that thy love of God shall be so much the less, as the number of things thou lovest together with him is greater. Great possessions thou must renounce as superfluous. Thou dost not need them, and it is a crime to keep them for no purpose. The little thou standest in need of should also be esteemed but little, for it would be a great error to embarrass the heart with that which is of no account and can hinder it much. If thou hast that according to thy judgment is necessary for human wants, thou art not in reality poor, for to be poor properly and strictly means to have less than what is necessary. Those to whom nothing is wanting call themselves rich. To possess more than is necessary creates unrest and affliction of spirit. To desire and look for what is not used will be a poverty without quiet or satisfaction. I require of thee such a freedom of spirit as not to attach thyself to anything, be it great or small, superfluous or necessary, of the things that are necessary for human life, except only so much as is needed to prevent death or indecency. Let this latter be of the poorest, and of such as is patched up sufficient to cover thee, and in thy nourishment seek what is most coarse, without satisfying thy particular whims of taste, but asking for what is insipid and tasteless, so that on purpose thou mayest be served with what is disagreeable, and be deprived of what the appetite craves, thus seeking in all things the greatest perfection. The vow of chastity includes purity of body and soul. This is easily lost, and it is difficult sometimes, according to the manner of losing it, even impossible to repair. This great treasure is deposited in a castle which has many portals and openings, and if these are not all well guarded and defended, the treasure is without security. My daughter, in order to preserve perfectly this vow, it is necessary to make an inviolable pact with thy senses, not to use them except for what is according to the dictates of reason and for the glory of thy Creator. After once the senses are mortified, it will be easy to overcome thy enemies, for only through them can they conquer thee. For no thoughts can recur or be awakened to activity unless fomented and excited by the images and impressions admitted through the exterior senses. Thou shouldest not touch, nor look upon, nor speak to any person of whatever condition, whether man or woman, so as to let their images or resemblances find entry into thy imagination. This carefulness which I enjoin will be the guard of the purity which I require of thee. If on account of charity or obedience thou must converse with them, for only these virtues are sufficient causes for conversing with creatures, do it with all gravity, modesty, and reserve. In regard to thy own person, live as if thou wert a pilgrim and stranger in this world. Be poor, mortified, laborious, loving the hardship connected with temporal things, without expecting alleviation or enjoyment, as one who is absent from her home and her country, enlisted to work and battle against powerful foes. Since the flesh is the center of weakness and danger, it is proper that thou carefully resist thy natural likings, and through them the temptations of the demons. Raise thyself above thyself, and seek a habitation far above all that is earthly, in order that thou mayest live under the shadow of him whom thou desirest. Canticles 2:3. And in this protection thou shalt enjoy tranquillity and true refreshment. Deliver thyself over with thy whole heart to his chaste and holy love, without attending to any creatures, except in so far as they may help and oblige thee to love and serve thy Creator. In all other respects abhor them. Although no virtue should be wanting in her who professes herself and is entitled to call herself a spouse of Christ, yet it is the virtue of chastity which makes her most worthy and like to her spouse. For it is chastity that makes her spiritual and withdraws her from earthly corruption, elevating her to angelic life and to a certain resemblance of God himself. This virtue beautifies and adorns all the rest, raises the body to a higher existence, enlightens the mind, and preserves in the soul a nobility above all that is corruptible. Because this virtue was an especial fruit of the redemption merited by the Son on the cross, where he paid for the sins of the world, therefore Holy Scripture expressly mentions that virgins accompany and follow the Lamb. Apocalypse 14:4. The vow of enclosure in the wall of chastity and of all virtues, the preserve where they are nourished and expanded. It is a privilege granted by heaven to the spouses of Christ in religion, dispensing them from the burdensome and dangerous tribute which the freedom of the world pays to the ruler of its vanities. By this vow the religious live as in a secure port, while other souls navigate and are tossed about in the storms of a dangerous sea. With so many advantages, enclosure cannot be considered as a confinement in a narrow space, for in it are offered to the religious the spacious fields of virtue, of the knowledge of God, of his infinite perfections, of his mysteries, and of his benefits conferred on man. On such spacious grounds can a nun recreate and enjoy herself, and only when she fails in this enjoyment does she begin to feel narrow confinement in this, the greatest freedom. For thee, my daughter, let there be no other playground, nor do I wish to see thee confine thyself to so narrow limits as even the whole visible world. Rise up to the height of the knowledge and love of God, where there are no limits or confines to hold thee, and where thou canst live in unbounded liberty. From the eminence thou wilt see how small, vile, and despicable is that is created, and how much too narrow it is to hold thy soul. To the necessary enclosure of the body add also the restrictions of the senses, in order that, imbued with fortitude, they may preserve for thee interior purity, and through it keep ablaze the fire of the sanctuary. Leviticus 6:12. When thou must continue to nourish and watch lest it be extinguished, in order to better guard the senses and profit from the vow of enclosure, do not approach the portals, nor the speaking gate, nor the windows, and do not even remember that the convent is furnished therewith, unless it is required by some particular office or by obedience. Desire nothing, and therefore strive after nothing, and do not exert thyself for that which is not allowed thee to desire. In retirement, solitude, and circumspection wilt thou find thy peace. Thereby wilt thou give me pleasure and merit for thyself, copious fruit, and the reward of love and grace which thou desirest. Wow. Of the perfection in which Most Holy Mary passed her days in the temple, and of the exercises which she was ordered to undertake. Let us now return to our heavenly narrative. After the Most Holy Child had begun to consecrate the temple by her holy presence and daily life, she grew from day to day in wisdom and grace before God and before men. The understanding which was given me of that, which the powerful hand of God proceeded to work in the heavenly princess during these years, placed me, as it were, at the shore of a vast and unmeasured sea, leaving me lost in astonishment and doubt as to how I am to embark on such an immense ocean for the destined port. For I am forced to leave much unsaid, and it is difficult to describe even the smallest part. I will relate that which the Most High explained to me on one occasion in his own words. Quote, the works of her who was to be the mother of the God-man were altogether and in every way most perfect, and even to understand them exceeds the capacity of all human creatures and of the angels. Her interior acts of the virtues were so precious and of such great merit and favor that they surpass all that the seraphim can do, and thou, my soul, wilt much better understand than be able to explain them with the words of thy tongue. But it is my will that during thy pilgrimage in thy mortal body thou must place Most Holy Mary as the beginning of thy joy, and that thou follow her through the desert of renunciation and abnegation of all that is human and visible. Follow her by a perfect imitation according to the measure of thy strength, and of the light which thou receivest. Let her be thy guiding star and thy directress. She will manifest to thee my will, and will let thee find my holy law, which is written in her by the power of my right hand. Meditate upon it day and night. She, by her intercession, will strike the rock of Christ's humanity, Numbers 20:11, in order that in this desert may abound the waters of divine grace and light, so that thy thirst may be quenched, thy understanding enlightened, and thy will inflamed. She will be a pillar of light to illuminate thy path, Exodus 13:21, and a cloud to afford thee shade and refreshment against the ardors of thy passions and the fierceness of thy enemies. Thou wilt have in her an angel, who will guard and guide thee, and, Exodus 23:21, lead thee away from the dangers of Babylon and of Sodom, so that my punishment shall not reach thee. Thou wilt have in her a mother to love thee, a friend to counsel thee, a mistress to direct thee, a protectress to shield thee, and a queen whom thou canst serve and obey as a handmaid. In the virtues which this mother of the only begotten exercised in the temple, thou wilt find a summary of all the highest perfections, according to which thou shouldest arrange thy life. An exact and reliable copy of all her sanctity, the beauty of virginity, the loveliness of humility, the utmost promptness in devotion and obedience, the steadfastness of faith, the certitude of hope, the fire of love, and the most complete outline map of all the wonders of my right hand. According to this rule, thou must regulate thy life. By this mirror thou must arrange and adorn it, adding to the beauty and grace of a bride that wishes to enter into the chamber of her spouse and Lord. If the nobility and condition of the teacher are a spur to the disciple, and tend to make his doctrine more acceptable, who can attract thee more powerfully than thy instructress, who is the mother of thy spouse, chosen as the most pure and holy among women, and without blemish of sin, being at the same time a virgin and the mother of the only begotten of the eternal Father, the splendor of his divinity in his own essence. Hear then this sovereign mistress, follow her in close imitation, and meditate without ceasing upon her admirable excellence and virtues. Remember that the life and conversation she led in the temple is the original, which all the souls that consecrate themselves after her as spouses of Christ must copy within themselves. Unquote. The above is the explanation and instruction which the Most High gave me in outline concerning the life and conduct of the Most Holy Mary in the temple. But let us proceed now to a more particular description of her actions. After the vision of the divinity described in the second chapter, after she had offered herself entirely to the Lord and delivered up to her instructress all that she possessed, being thus deprived of all, entirely bound over to obedience, and hiding beneath greater than that of the seraphim, she requested the priest and her teacher to prescribe for her an order of life and to direct her in the occupations which she was to assume. The priest and her instructress, having together considered her petition with the aid of a special enlightenment from on high, and desiring to regulate from now on the exercises of this heavenly child of only 3 years, called her to their presence. The Princess of Heaven remained kneeling before them during this interview, and although they bade her rise, she begged most humbly to be allowed to remain in this reverent position in the presence of the minister and priest of the Most High and of her teacher on account of their office and dignity. The priest spoke to her and said, quote, "My daughter, as a very young child, the Lord has drawn thee to his house and holy temple. Be thankful for this favor and seek to profit by it, by striving hard to serve him in truth and with an upright heart. Acquire all the virtues in order that thou mayest return from this holy place prepared and fortified against the troubles and dangers of this world. Obey thy mistress Anne, and commence early to bear the sweet yoke of virtue, in order that thou mayest find it more easy to bear during the rest of thy life." Unquote. The sovereign child answered, quote, "Do thou, my master, who art the minister and priest of God, and holdest his place, and thou, my mistress, together with him, command and instruct me in whatever I am to do, so that I may not commit any fault. This I beg of you, wishing to obey you in all things." Unquote. The priest and her teacher Anne felt within themselves a great enlightenment and a divine impulse to attend especially to this heavenly child and to care for her more than the other maidens. Conferring with themselves about this great esteem with which they had been inspired, Though ignorant of the mystery by which it came to them, they resolved to devote particular attention to her guidance and assistance. But as their care could extend only to the exterior and visible actions, they were far from suspecting the interior acts and inspirations of her heart, for over these the Most High watched with singular protection and favor. Thus the pure heart of the Princess of Heaven remained free to advance and grow in interior vision, without losing one instant in which she did not reach what is highest and most excellent in virtue. The priest also gave her a rule for her occupations, and said, quote, "My daughter, thou wilt assist at the exercises of divine praise and song in honor of the Lord with all reverence and devotion, and always pray to the Most High for the necessities of his holy temple and of his people, and for the coming of the Messiah. At 8 o'clock thou wilt retire for sleep, and at the beginning of dawn thou wilt arise in order to praise the Lord until the 3rd hour." This corresponds to our 9 o'clock in the morning. "From the 3rd hour until evening thou wilt occupy thyself in some manual works, in order that thou mayest be instructed in all things. At meals, of which thou wilt partake after thy exercise, observe befitting moderation. Then thou wilt go to hear the instructions of thy teacher. The rest of the day thou wilt engage thyself in the reading of Holy Scriptures, and in all things be humble, affable, and obedient to the commands of thy instructress." Unquote. The Most Holy Child remained on her knees while she listened to the words of the priest, and then asked his blessing. Having kissed his hand and the hand of her mistress, she proposed in her heart to observe the order of life assigned her during her stay in the temple, and as long as they should not command her otherwise. And she, who was the mistress of sanctity, fulfilled their orders as if she were the least of all the scholars. Her desires and her most ardent love impelled her to many other external exercises which they had not included in their orders, but with regard to these she subjected herself to the minister of the Lord, preferring the sacrifice of a perfect and holy obedience to the high dictates of her own fervor. She knew, as mistress of all perfection, that the divine will is more surely fulfilled by the humble acquiescence of obedience than in following the highest aspirations to other virtues. By this rare example, let souls, and especially those in the religious state, learn not to follow their own effervescences and whims contrary to the obedience and the will of their superiors, for in the latter God makes known to us his desire and pleasure, whereas in the former we seek only our own fancies. In the superiors God himself operates in ourselves if we work contrary to their orders. Temptations, blind passion, and deceit is active. In the performance of works not commanded her, our queen and lady distinguished herself from other maidens by asking her teacher to be allowed to serve them all, and be engaged in the humble occupation of scrubbing and cleaning the rooms, and of washing the dishes. Although this seemed extraordinary, especially in one of the firstborn children, who were treated with greater consideration and respect, yet the incomparable humility of the heavenly princess could not be restrained or confined by any consideration of what was due to her position, but reached out for the most humble occupations. With such an eager humility, she knew how to gain time and opportunity for doing such work, that she was beforehand in assuming the tasks of others. By means of her infused science, she understood all the mysteries and ceremonies of the temple, but she was anxious to learn them also by study and practice, as if she were ignorant of them, nor did she ever fail in any ceremony or duty, no matter how small. She was most eager for humiliation and most submissive in her self-contempt. Every morning and evening she asked the blessing of her teacher and kissed her hand, and the same she did whenever she was ordered or was permitted to perform works of humility. Sometimes, when it was allowed her, she kissed her feet with profound humility. The sovereign princess was so docile, so sweet and friendly in her actions, so ready to serve and so eager and diligent in humbling herself, so anxious to show kindness and esteem toward all the maidens in the temple, obeying them as if each had been her mistress, that she ravished all the hearts. By her ineffable and heavenly prudence, she proceeded in all her actions in such a manner that she never lost an occasion for engaging in lowly work, in humble service of her companions, and in the fulfillment of the divine pleasure. But what shall I, most vile creature, and what shall all faithful children of the Catholic Church think when describing and considering such a vivid example of humility? It seems to us great virtue when the inferior obeys the superior, the lowly yields to the exalted, and when we esteem it a great humility that the equal submit to his equal. But when the inferior commands and the superior obeys, when the queen humbles herself before her slave, when the most holy and the most perfect of all creatures submits to a mere wormlet, the queen of heaven and earth to the least of women, and when this is done with all her heart and in all sincerity, who is not astonished and confounded in his vapid pride? Who will not see, as in a clear mirror, his unhappy presumption? Who can convince himself that he knows what true humility is, much less exercise it, when he sees it exhibited in its reality and in its own element? The Most Holy Mary. Let us, souls who live under the vow of obedience, approach this light in order to perceive and correct the disorders which show themselves whenever obedience to our God-given superiors requires renouncement of our whims and therefore becomes hard and troublesome. Here let our hardness be crushed. Let the proudest humiliate herself and be confounded in her shameful pride. Let her banish all presumption, and let her not account herself obedient and humble, because on certain occasions she has yielded to the superiors, for she is yet far from thinking herself inferior and beneath her companion, as Mary did, who is superior to all. The beauty, grace, elegance, and courteousness of our Queen were incomparable, for all the natural graces and gifts which were hers in a most perfect degree were reinforced by the splendor of supernatural or divine grace, and effected a marvelous union of grace and beauty in all her being and activity, enthralling all in love and admiration of her. Divine Providence moderated the outward demonstrations of this affection, which those who conversed with her would have shown if they had been left to the natural force of their spontaneous love of the Queen. In eating and in sleep, as in all other virtues, she was most perfect. She observed the measure dictated by temperance. Never did she exceed, nor could she; rather she deducted from the necessary. Although her curtailed sleep did not interrupt her high contemplation, as I have said before, yet she would have gladly omitted it altogether in virtue of obedience. However, she retired to rest at the time appointed, and on her humble and poor couch, strewn with the flowers of virtue, Canticles 1:15, and surrounded by the seraphim and the angelic host who guarded and assisted her, she enjoyed more exalted contemplation, outside of beatific vision, and more ardent ecstasies of love than all of them together. She divided her time and applied it with rare prudence, so as to give to each of her actions and occupations its proper share. She read much in the sacred writings of the ancients, and by means of her infused science, she was so well versed in them, that in all their profound mysteries, that none of them was unfamiliar to her. For the Most High made known to her all their mysteries and sacraments. She treated and conversed about them in her conferences with the holy angels of her guard, familiarizing herself with them and asking about them with incomparable intelligence and great acuteness. If this sovereign mistress had written what she understood, we would have many other additions to the sacred scriptures, and we would be able to draw out of them a perfect understanding of those writings and the deep meanings and mysteries of all those preserved in the Church. All the plenitude of this science she utilized for the worship, praise, and love of God. To this she applied all knowledge, without allowing one ray of her divine enlightenment to remain sterile or idle. She was most subtle in discourse, most profound in her intelligence, most exalted and loving in her thoughts, most prudent in her choice and arrangement, most efficacious and sweet in her operations, and in all things she was a most perfect example and an object of admiration for men and angels, and even, in a way, for the Lord himself, who had formed her altogether according to his heart and pleasure. Instruction of the Sovereign Mistress. My daughter, human nature is imperfect and remiss in practicing virtue, and easily weakens in its exercise, for it continually seeks rest and evades labor with all its might. When the soul listens to and extemporizes with the animal and carnal part of its nature, this latter will engross and overcome the forces of reason and of the spirit, and will reduce them to a dangerous and shameful slavery. This disorder is abominable, and much to be feared by all, but God abhors it without comparison more in its ministers and in religious. They, as a matter of course, are supposed to be perfect, and therefore are injured so much the more seriously, if they do not come out victorious in the conflict with the passions. By remissness in battle and by their frequent defeats, they leave They live themselves into a paralyzing and self-satisfied conviction of false security, content with the performance of certain easy outward practices of virtue, at the same time imagining, without the least real advancement, that they are moving mountains. The demon then introduces other distractions and temptations, and on account of their small appreciation of the rules and practices of religion, they begin to weaken in all of them, esteem them as light and unimportant matter, and living on in their false security come to lose the very perception of true virtue. I desire that thou, my daughter, guard against this error. Remember that a voluntary remissness in regard to one imperfection prepares and opens the way for others. These facilitate the commission of venial sins, these again of mortal sins. Thus the descent is from one abyss to the other until the bottom is found in the disregard of all evil. In order to prevent such a misfortune, it is necessary to intercept from afar the current of sin, for the practice or ceremony, which seems but small, is an outwork which keeps the enemy at a distance, while the precepts and laws concerning more important matters are the fortress walls of conscience. If the demon can break through and gain the outer defenses, he is in better position to gain the inner ones. If then an opening is made in the bulwarks by the commission of sin, although it may not be a very grievous one, he already has a better opportunity to make an assault on the interior reign of a soul. As the soul finds herself weakened by vicious acts and habits and without strength of grace, she does not resist the attack with fortitude, and the devil, acquiring more and more power over her, begins to subject and oppress her without opposition. Consider, therefore, now, my dearest, how great must be thy watchfulness, and how great is the necessity of not falling asleep in the midst of so many dangers. Remember that thou art a religious, a spouse of Christ, a superior, taught and enlightened, favored with so many singular blessings. By these privileges and many others which thou wilt find connected with them, thou shouldest gauge thy solicitude, for thou owest a return and correspondence in all of them to the Lord. Exert thyself to be punctual in the fulfillment of all the rules and practices of religion. Let there be no rule, no command, and no exercise of perfection, whichever will seem small to thee. Despise or forget none of them. Observe them all with rigor, for in the eyes of God all is precious and of great import when placed according to his pleasure. It is certain that he finds pleasure in seeing his commands fulfilled, and is offended in seeing them set aside. Therefore, in all things consider that thou hast a spouse whom thou must please, a God whom thou must serve, a father whom thou must obey, a judge whom thou must fear, and a mistress whom thou shouldest imitate and follow. In order that thou mayest fulfill all this, thou must renew in thy soul the strong resolution not to listen to thy inclinations, nor to yield to the negligence and weakness of thy nature. Do not omit any practice or exercise on account of its difficulty, as for instance, kissing the ground as thou hast been accustomed to do according to the custom of the religious. Both small and great perform with a loving constancy, and thus thou wilt be pleasing in the eyes of my son and myself. In the works of supererogation, after praying for a holy alacrity, ask advice of thy confessor and superior, and perform them with a spirit entirely free of any predilection or self-love. That which they direct, accept and write in thy heart, never resting in its punctual fulfillment. If it is possible to avail thyself of obedience and counsel, never decide for thyself on anything, how good soever it may appear to thee, for the true will of God is always manifest in holy obedience. I can't really see my timer clock, so it'll probably buzz here in a minute. Yes, it will. I see it's been 43 minutes and there it goes. May God bless and keep you.